Sorry, sir, we can't have animals inside. We just want a warm meal. I have the money. Cole, you're always welcome here, brother. Come on in.
The host at the door of the forward line took one look at the man in the stained field jacket, and the dog pressed against his leg, and told him flatly that the restaurant didn't allow panhandling on the property, and neither one of them had any idea yet that the man standing behind the reservation podium, the one who owned the place, had once carried that same beggar's unconscious body 400 meters under fire and would have died himself before letting anything happen to him. Cole Bishop had been sleeping in his car for 6 weeks by the time he wandered onto that sidewalk in downtown Amarillo, though car was a generous word for the 04 Corolla with a cracked windshield and a back seat that folded down just enough to let a grown man lie at an angle that wasn't quite fetal and wasn't quite flat either. Before the car, there had been an apartment, and before the apartment, a job at a warehouse distribution center that had let him go 8 months into his employment with a form letter citing restructuring, and before the job, an honorable discharge from the United States Army after 7 years of service that had ended with a disability rating so low it barely covered the cost of his monthly medication, let alone rent in a city where rent had climbed faster than any government check ever could. He was 31 years old, and he had done 2 tours as an infantryman with the 75th Ranger Regiment, the second of which had ended with a gunshot wound to his hip that had shattered enough bone to leave him with a permanent limp, and a titanium rod that set off airport metal detectors every single time, and a case of post-traumatic stress that the Army's own doctors had documented extensively and that the Department of Veterans Affairs had somehow, through a bureaucratic sleight of hand Cole still didn't fully understand, decided was only 40% disabling. 40%. He'd read that number so many times on the ratings letter that the ink had practically worn off the page from his thumb running over it, as if enough friction might change what it said. He ate what he could afford, which most days meant whatever the dollar menu offered or whatever a church pantry handed out on Tuesdays, and he'd lost enough weight in the 6 weeks since the car became home that his jacket, once snug across his shoulders, now hung off him in a way that made strangers cross the street rather than walk past him on the sidewalk. He didn't blame them, not really. He'd have crossed the street too, once, before he understood how fast a life could come apart when the systems meant to catch a falling man simply didn't. The dog had come into his life 4 weeks into the car, on a night cold enough that Cole had parked behind a shuttered auto parts store just to get out of the worst of the wind, and had heard, over the tick of his cooling engine, a thin high whine coming from a stack of wooden pallets against the back fence. He'd almost ignored it. He had exactly nothing to offer another creature in need, not food, not shelter, not even reliable warmth, and some hard practical part of his brain told him to leave it alone, to save what little he had for himself. But the whine kept up, thin and persistent, and Cole had climbed out of the car against his own better judgment and found, wedged between 2 pallets, a dog so thin its ribs showed clean through a coat matted with mud and burrs, one back leg held up at an angle that told him, even in the dark, that something was badly wrong with it. "Well, hell," Cole said, crouching down slow, the way he'd learned once, a lifetime ago, to approach anything wounded and frightened. "You and me both, huh?" The dog didn't growl. It watched him with a stillness that struck Cole as strange for an animal in that much visible pain, ears up despite everything, and when he finally got close enough to see its face clearly in the glow of his phone's flashlight, he found a German shepherd, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with a scar running along its muzzle and a patch of fur missing from one shoulder where the skin beneath had healed rough and pale. He didn't have money for a vet. He barely had money for himself, but he had a blanket in the trunk and half a rotisserie chicken from a gas station that he'd been saving, and he gave the dog both, working slow and patient to gain enough trust to lift the injured leg gently and confirm, as best his non-medical eye could tell, that nothing was freshly broken, just old damage healed wrong, the kind of injury that explained a permanent limp rather than an emergency. He carried the dog to his car anyway, because leaving it there in the cold felt like a cruelty he couldn't stomach even with nothing to offer, and it rode the rest of that night curled in the passenger footwell, and by morning it hadn't left. "This isn't a rescue situation," Cole told it, the next day, parked at a gas station where he was using the last of his cash to fill the tank a quarter of the way. "I can't afford you. I can barely afford me." The dog looked up at him from the passenger seat, tail giving one slow, uncertain thump against the upholstery, and Cole exhaled a long breath through his nose and bought a second bag of the cheapest dog food the gas station carried, and that was, more or less, the end of any pretense that this was temporary. He called it 6, for no reason he could fully explain except that the number had come to him, unbidden the first morning, the way names sometimes did, and it had stuck before he'd had the chance to think of anything better. Six rode with him everywhere after that, through the long, aimless days of looking for work that never quite materialized, through the nights parked behind whatever building offered the most wind cover, and Cole found, somewhat to his own surprise, that having another living thing depending on him, even a broken, limping stray with a mysterious past, gave a shape to his days that had been missing since the discharge paperwork came through. It was 3 weeks into that arrangement, on a morning cold enough to leave frost on the Corolla's windshield, that a free veterinary clinic set up in a church parking lot caught Cole's eye, a banner strung between two poles advertising basic checkups and vaccinations for pets belonging to unhoused individuals. No charge, no questions asked. He'd almost driven past it. Pride, or something adjacent to pride, had kept him from most of the assistance programs the city offered, a stubborn refusal to be one more statistic standing in a line. But Six's limp had been getting worse, not better, and Cole understood enough about pain, his own and otherwise, to know that ignoring it rarely made it go away. The volunteer veterinarian, a soft-spoken older man named Dr. Aldous Finch, who ran the clinic out of the back of a converted horse trailer, ran his hands gently along Six's hips and shoulders, checked the old muzzle scar, and then, almost as an afterthought, reached for a handheld scanner and ran it slowly along the dog's neck and shoulders. "Well now," Finch said, squinting at the readout, "this old boy's got a chip. Format's outdated, but I've got a reader that goes back far enough." He worked for a moment, cross-referencing something on a laptop balanced precariously on a folding table, and his eyebrows rose. "This is a military registry number. Army working dog program, from what I can tell. You didn't know that?" Cole stared at the dog sitting calm and patient at his feet, that scarred muzzle and permanently crooked leg suddenly reading differently in his mind, no longer just evidence of a hard life on the street, but potentially something else entirely. "No idea," he said. "Found him behind an auto parts store, half-starved, hurt leg. Figured he was just somebody's runaway." "Might be worth finding out more," Finch said, jotting the registry number down on a card and handing it to Cole. "I did 2 tours as an Army vet myself, years back. There's a retired program coordinator I still keep in touch with, worked out of Lackland for a long stretch. I could reach out if you want. No promises on what we'd find." Cole had taken the card, mostly out of politeness, not expecting much to come of it, but that evening parked behind the church where he'd been allowed to stay overnight in exchange for helping stack folding chairs after the clinic wrapped. He'd found himself turning the card over and over in his hands, looking at the number, looking at the dog curled against his hip in the cramped back seat, and had finally, almost against his own will, texted Finch to say yes, go ahead, find out what you can. It took Finch a little over a week, working the inquiry through his old contact in whatever spare time the man's own schedule allowed, and when he called Cole back, his voice carried a weight that told Cole, before a single word had been spoken, that this wasn't going to be a simple answer. "His name's Ranger," Finch said, and Cole felt something strange move through his chest at the coincidence of it, a small private irony that a homeless former Ranger had unknowingly adopted a dog carrying the same word as a name. Army working dog, trained for patrol and detection work, deployed once, attached to a military police unit doing convoy security. "Records get thin after that. My contact says there's a note about him being retired early due to injury sustained in an IED incident that also killed his handler, and after that the trail just goes cold. No adoption record, no disposition. Same story you hear too often with these dogs. The system loses track of them the second they stop being useful, and nobody follows up to make sure they land somewhere decent." Cole sat with that for a long moment, looking down at the dog dozing against his leg in the church parking lot, midday sun warming the both of them through the windshield. "Sounds familiar," he said quietly. "I imagine it does," Finch said, not unkindly. "That night," Cole ran his hand slowly along Ranger's old scars, the muzzle wound, the crooked leg, and understood he was looking at another version of his own story, another body used hard in service of something bigger, and then discarded without a second thought once the usefulness had run out. "We're a matched set," he told the dog, echoing words he didn't know a Kentucky farmhouse crew chief had used about his own rescue 1,000 miles away, and Ranger's tail thumped once against the car seat, and something in Cole's chest, some door that had been rusted shut since his discharge, creaked open another half-inch. The weeks after that settled into their own rhythm, if a life lived out of a Corolla could be said to have rhythm. Cole learned Ranger's habits the way he'd once learned a fire team's, the specific low huff that meant anxiety climbing, usually triggered by sudden loud noises or by men who moved too fast and too close. The way Ranger positioned himself, unprompted, between Cole and any stranger who approached the car, not aggressive, just present, a quiet wall of solid muscle that made Cole feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like somebody had his back. He learned that Ranger, despite the crooked leg, could still move with surprising speed and control when something drew his focus. A discipline that spoke, Cole understood now, of real training that 6 years of hard living hadn't managed to erase. There was a particular evening ritual that became theirs, once the weather allowed it, a walk along the drainage canal behind the shopping center, where Cole sometimes parked, Ranger limping along beside him, with an easy patience that never seemed to mind the pace Cole's own damaged hip forced on both of them, and Cole talking the whole way through. Working out loud through the tangled mess of his own head, in a way he'd never managed with the 2 VA-mandated counseling sessions he'd attended before giving up on the process entirely. I used to think if I just held it together long enough, somebody would notice and things would sort themselves out, he told Ranger one such evening, the canal water catching the last orange light of a panhandle sunset. Turns out that's not really how it works. Turns out you can hold something together for years, and it doesn't matter one bit if nobody's watching. Ranger pressed against his leg, exactly the way he always did when Cole's voice dropped into that particular register, and Cole reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. And for a moment, just a moment, the weight in his chest felt lighter than it had in longer than he wanted to admit. It was on a Thursday evening in early November, cold enough that Cole had been putting off the decision of where to park for the night. That hunger and a rare $20 bill from a day of helping a stranger move furniture combined to send him walking down a downtown street, lined with restaurants he could ordinarily never afford, looking for something warm and filling that his $20 might actually stretch to cover. That was how he ended up standing outside the Forward Line, a restaurant with a rustic wooden brick front and a chalkboard menu in the window advertising a Thursday special, Ranger limping patiently at his side on a length of rope that served as a leash. And that was how he ended up, 3 minutes later, standing in the restaurant's entryway being told by a young host in a crisp black apron that the establishment didn't permit panhandling and would he please move along. "I'm not panhandling," Cole said, keeping his voice even, though something in his chest had gone tight and small the way it always did when a stranger looked at him and saw nothing but the dirt on his jacket. "I've got money. I wanted to get something to eat." The host's eyes flicked unmistakably to the dog, to the rope leash, to the general state of Cole's clothes, and something in his expression made clear the verdict had already been reached regardless of what Cole actually had in his pocket. "Sir, I really need you to step outside. We can't have." "What's the holdup, Danny?" The voice came from behind the reservation podium, low and even, carrying an authority that made the young host straighten up on reflex, and Cole turned toward it without much expectation, already bracing for one more voice telling him he didn't belong, and found himself looking at a face he hadn't seen in 6 years but would have recognized anywhere, in any light, in any lifetime. A face that had once looked at him across a smoke-filled compound in Kandahar province and told him, with total unshakable certainty, that they were both getting out of there alive. "Bishop," the man said, and his own expression went through a rapid transformation, disbelief giving way to something closer to shock, and then, unmistakably, to a grief so plain it was almost hard to watch. "Cole Bishop, Jesus, Jesus Christ." Cole stood frozen in the entryway, TW. Tie dollars crumpled in his fist, a stray dog on a rope leash pressed against his leg, and looked at the man who had once been Staff Sergeant Marcus Reyes, his squad leader for 2 deployments, the man who had carried Cole 400 meters under fire after the IED that had shattered his hip, refusing every order to leave him and fall back, dragging him the whole distance while rounds kicked up dirt around both of them, and who now, apparently, owned a restaurant in downtown Amarillo and was staring at Cole like he'd seen a ghost. "Sarge," Cole managed, and found his voice had gone rough in a way that embarrassed him. Reyes came around the podium fast, closing the distance in a few long strides, and pulled Cole into a hard embrace that Cole hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to receive, his body stiffening on reflex before something in him gave way and he let himself lean into it, just for a second, just long enough to feel the specific solid weight of a man who had once saved his life. "What happened to you?" Reyes said, pulling back, his hands still gripping Cole's shoulders, his eyes moving over the too thin frame, the stained jacket, the dog watching the whole exchange with cautious, alert attention. "Danny, what's wrong with you, letting a man stand out here?" He turned on the young host, who had gone pale with the sudden realization of exactly whose company he'd been about to eject. This man served 2 combat tour with the Rangers. "He is welcome in my restaurant any single day of the week, you understand me. Any day, any time, no exceptions, and I don't care what he's wearing or who he's got with him." "Yes, sir," Danny said, mortified. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to know," Reyes said, more gently now, though his hand hadn't left Cole's shoulder. "That's on me for not training better. Go set up a table. Best one we've got." He turned back to Cole, and something in his face had settled into a kind of fierce, protective determination that Cole remembered vividly from a decade earlier, the specific expression Reyes had worn every time he'd made a decision about his men that he wasn't going to be argued out of. "You're not going anywhere tonight, Bishop, not until you and I have caught up properly, and bring the dog. Anybody's got a problem with a working veteran's dog in my restaurant, they can find somewhere else to eat." Ranger, as it turned out, was welcome not just for that one dinner, but for every visit that followed, because what started as a single meal turned, over the following hour, into something considerably larger. Reyes sat across from Cole in a corner booth long after the kitchen had stopped taking new orders, listening while Cole laid out, haltingly at first and then in a flood he hadn't expected, the whole arc of the 6 years since their unit had disbanded, the discharge, the disability rating, the warehouse job that hadn't lasted, the apartment he'd lost, the car, the weeks sleeping behind whatever building offered wind cover, and finally Ranger. Found half-starved behind an auto parts store on a cold night that Cole now understood, with the clarity of hindsight, had probably saved both their lives in different ways. "I should have looked for you," Reyes said quietly, once Cole had finished, his jaw working with something that looked like genuine anger, though not at Cole. "I got out 18 months before you did, should have kept better track of everybody, that's on me." "Wasn't your job to track me down, Sarge," Cole said. "The hell it wasn't," Reyes said. "A man doesn't stop being your responsibility just because the uniform comes off." He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass slowly on the table. "I'm not gonna sit here and pretend I can fix 6 years in one dinner, but you're not sleeping in that car tonight, and you're not sleeping in it tomorrow night either. I've got a room above the restaurant, used to be storage. I converted it last year when my nephew needed a place for a few months. It's yours as long as you need it, and I need a dishwasher who can eventually work up to line cook if you're interested, because my current guy just gave his 2 weeks, and I trust exactly nobody in this town, the way I trust a man who once carried half my gear 400 meters on a shattered ankle rather than slow down the medevac." Cole had sat with that offer for a long moment, pride and exhaustion, and something that might have been hope all warring in his chest at once. And Ranger, sensing something in the shift of his posture, had pressed his head against Cole's knee under the table. "Okay," Cole said finally, and his voice cracked on the single word in a way he didn't bother trying to hide. "Okay, yeah." The months that followed were, in their own quiet way, as significant a rebuilding as anything Cole had gone through in the Army. He moved into the small converted room above the forward line, spare but clean, with a window that looked out over the alley and a mattress that, after 6 weeks in a Corolla's back seat, felt like the finest bed in Texas. Ranger settled in immediately, claiming a corner by the window as his own, and within a week had become something of an unofficial mascot for the restaurant staff, tolerated in the kitchen's back hallway during service hours and doted on by the wait staff during the slow afternoon stretches. Cole started at the bottom, exactly as Reyes had promised, scrubbing pots and running dishes through the industrial washer for shifts that left his damaged hip aching by closing time. But he found, to his own quiet surprise, that the physical exhaustion of honest work settled something in him that idle days searching for jobs never had. Reyes checked on him constantly, not hovering exactly, but present, stopping by the dish pit between orders to ask how he was sleeping, whether the medication he'd finally gotten refilled through a veteran's clinic Reyes had personally driven him to was helping, whether the nightmares had eased any. "You don't have to babysit me, Sarge," Cole told him, more than once, though the protest carried less weight each time he made it. "Wasn't babysitting when I dragged you out of that compound either," Reyes said, "and I don't recall you complaining much about it then." There was a particular evening, maybe 6 weeks into the arrangement, when Cole finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been sitting in his chest since that first dinner. "Why'd you get into restaurants anyway? Never figured you for it." Reyes had leaned against the prep counter, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave most things. "Truth is, I didn't figure myself for it either. Got out, didn't know what to do with myself for a good year, same as half the guys we served with. Then I started cooking just for myself, just to have something to do with my hands that wasn't sitting around remembering things I'd rather not remember. Turned out I was decent at it. Turned out a kitchen, run right, isn't so different from a squad. Everybody's got a job. Everybody depends on everybody else doing it well, and there's a rhythm to it that quiets my head down same way patrol used to. Opened this place 4 years back with everything I had saved plus a loan I'm still paying off. Some days I think it was the smartest thing I ever did. Other days I think I'm one bad month away from losing it all." Cole hadn't thought much of that last comment at the time, filing it away as the ordinary anxiety of any small business owner. He'd understand, before too long, how close to literal truth it actually was. Ranger, in that same stretch of settling in, revealed a piece of his training that none of them had fully appreciated until circumstance drew it out. The restaurant's walk-in cooler had developed an intermittent gas smell that the staff had been chalking up to an aging compressor, something Ray's had a repair company scheduled to look at the following week. And on a Tuesday evening during the dinner rush, Ranger, usually content to doze in his corner by the back hallway during service, suddenly rose, crossed the kitchen with a purposeful limp, and planted himself rigid in front of the walk-in cooler door, refusing to move. Refusing every attempt by the kitchen staff to redirect him. "Ranger, come on, buddy, you're in the way," one of the line cooks said, trying to nudge him aside. The dog didn't budge. Cole, elbow deep in a sink of dirty pans, noticed the commotion and came over, and the moment he saw the specific rigid stillness in Ranger's posture, ears locked forward, weight braced, he felt something cold move through his chest, because it was a stillness he'd started to recognize as meaningful rather than random. "Everybody out of the kitchen," Cole said, and something in his tone made the staff listen without argument, years of dishwashing suddenly counting for nothing against the note of command that had crept back into his voice. "Sarge," he called toward the front of house, "get out here. Something's wrong with the gas line." Rays came fast, took one look at Ranger's alert posture, and didn't waste time asking questions. He killed the kitchen's gas supply at the main shutoff, evacuated the dining room with a calm efficiency that spoke of a man who'd handled far worse emergencies than a Tuesday dinner rush, and called the gas company's emergency line. What the technician found, 40 minutes later, was a slow leak in a connector behind the walk-in unit that had been building undetected for days, exactly the kind of fault that, left alone through a busy service and a warm kitchen full of open flame, could have ended in a catastrophe none of them wanted to think too hard about. "That dog," the technician said, running his hand along Ranger's head once the danger had passed, "just saved your building, and probably a few lives in it besides." Rays had looked at Ranger for a long moment afterward. Something unreadable moving across his face, and then at Cole. "That an accident, you think? Him picking tonight, of all nights, dinner rush, kitchen full of people, to finally make his move?" "No," Cole said, thinking of the crooked leg, the muzzle scar, the outdated military chip. "I don't think it was an accident at all." It was in the weeks after that incident, once word of the near miss had spread, and Rays had started introducing Ranger to regular customers with unmistakable pride, that a different and far less benign kind of trouble began working its way into the restaurant's orbit. The forward line sat on a corner lot that, as it turned out, had become the subject of considerable interest from a development company called Panhandle Premier Properties, which had spent the better part of a year quietly acquiring the surrounding block with an eye toward a mixed-use retail and apartment complex that would, according to the glossy renderings that had started circulating at city council meetings, transform the entire downtown corridor. Every business on the block had sold, one by one, over the preceding 18 months, some willingly, lured by generous buyout offers, others, Cole would later learn, considerably less willingly. Rays had refused every offer that came his way, first politely, then with increasing firmness as the offers grew more aggressive, and the company's representative, a smooth-talking man named Preston Yates, grew increasingly less patient with the refusals. "They want this whole block," Rays told Cole one evening, after closing, nursing a coffee at the same corner booth where he'd once listened to Cole's whole broken history unfold. "I'm the last holdout. Everybody else took the money and ran. I built this place with my own two hands, Bishop. I'm not selling it to some developer so they can put up condos with a rooftop pool nobody from this neighborhood will ever be able to afford." "They've been giving you trouble about it?" Cole asked, though something in Rays's tightened jaw already told him the answer. "Inspector's been out here 3 times this month," Rays said. 3 times, for a place that passed every inspection clean for 4 straight years before this. Found violations that weren't there last year, weren't there the year before that, costing me a fortune in fixes for problems I don't think actually exist. And now there's rumors going around that my insurance carrier's about to drop me over a claims history that, far as I know, doesn't exist either. Cole felt an old, familiar instinct sharpen in his chest, the same one that used to fire before a patrol went bad, a sense for the shape of a threat before it had fully declared itself. "You think somebody's leaning on the inspector?" "I think," Rays said carefully, "that I've got no proof of anything, and accusing a city official of corruption without proof is a good way to make my problems considerably worse. But I've been in this business long enough to know when something doesn't smell right, and this doesn't smell right." Cole thought about that phrase, "doesn't smell right," and looked down at Ranger, dozing under the booth's table, and felt the outline of an idea start to form that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet, not until he understood more clearly what he might be walking Ray's into. He started paying closer attention after that, the same patient, methodical watchfulness he'd once brought to reading terrain for threats a world away. He noticed the city inspector, a nervous, sweating man named Roland Prout, seemed to time his visits for hours when the restaurant was busiest, maximizing disruption. He noticed a black sedan that parked across the street more evenings than seemed coincidental, idling for 20 or 30 minutes before pulling away. And he noticed, on a slow Wednesday afternoon while restocking the walk-in, a face through the kitchen's back window that struck something uneasy and half familiar in his memory. A heavyset man in a Panhandle Premier Properties polo shirt standing at the mouth of the alley, watching the building with an attention that had nothing to do with real estate appraisal. It took Cole 2 days of turning that half-familiar face over in his memory before it clicked into place, and when it did, he felt a cold certainty settle into his chest that had nothing to do with coincidence. "Sarge," he said, catching Ray's alone in the office one evening, "the guy who's been watching the building from the alley, heavyset, buzz cut, got a scar through one eyebrow. That's Danny Osgood." Ray's went very still. "Osgood, from 2nd Platoon." "Same one," Cole said. "The supply sergeant they court-martialed for skimming equipment and reselling it off-book. Went to Leavenworth for it, far as I ever heard. He's working for Panhandle Premier now, or working with them at least." Ray sat back slowly in his chair, and Cole watched a decade-old anger surface fresh across his old sergeant's face. The particular fury of a man remembering exactly how much damage Osgood's theft had cost their unit at the time, gear that should have been available during a firefight that instead had to be scrounged and improvised, because a third of the platoon's replacement equipment had mysteriously never arrived. "That son of a bitch got out early on good behavior a couple years back," Ray said slowly. "I never gave him another thought. Never imagined I'd see his face again, let alone find him lurking behind my own restaurant." "You think this is personal," Cole said, "or just business he happened to land in?" "With Osgood," Ray said, "I don't imagine there's ever much difference between the two." Cole spent the next several days digging in whatever spare hours the dish pit and prep work allowed him, calling in a favor from a former squad mate who now worked in a records-adjacent civilian job, and what came back painted a picture considerably uglier than a simple property dispute. Danny Osgood, it turned out, had been hired by Panhandle Premier Properties 8 months earlier as a private security consultant, a title vague enough to cover a multitude of activities, and city permit records showed that Roland Prout, the inspector making Ray's life increasingly difficult, had purchased a boat 11 weeks earlier that a city inspector's modest salary shouldn't reasonably have covered. Deeper digging, aided by a friend of Cole's former squad mate who worked at the county clerk's office, turned up a shell company registered to a relative of Prout's that had received 2 payments totaling $14,000 from an account traceable, after several careful layers, back to Panhandle Premier's parent holding company. "That's a bribe," Ray said flatly, reviewing the printouts Cole had assembled on the same corner booth table, Ranger dozing beneath it as he so often did during these late-night conversations. "That's a documented bribe to a city inspector to manufacture code violations against my restaurant." "That's what it looks like to me," Cole said. "I'm no lawyer, Sarge, but I know enough about building a case to know we need more than what I've got before we take this anywhere official. Somebody like Yates isn't gonna go down easy on a couple bank records a dishwasher pieced together in his spare time." It was 2 nights later, closing time, the restaurant emptied out and the last of the kitchen staff gone home, that the threat Cole had been sensing finally showed its full shape. He and Ray's were doing the final walkthrough, checking locks, running the closing checklist, when Ranger, who had been quiet and settled all evening, dozing near the register through the last hour of service, suddenly rose, moved to the alley-facing back door, and dropped into his rigid, focused alert stance, nose working the crack beneath the door with an intensity Cole had only seen once before, that Tuesday night with the gas leak. "Sarge," Cole said quietly, already moving to kill the interior lights. "Something's out there. Same alert as the gas leak, but different. This is sharper. This is his detection posture, not his gas alert." Ray's didn't waste time asking how Cole knew the difference. 2 combat tour had taught both of them, in their own ways, to trust a trained animal's instincts over their own uncertain senses. He moved to the office, pulled up the feed from the restaurant's exterior security camera on his phone, and the 2 of them watched, in grainy black and white, as a figure in dark clothing moved along the alley toward the back of the building, carrying something in each hand that neither of them could identify clearly from the angle, but that Cole's gut told him, with cold certainty, was nothing good. That's Osgood, Reyes said, zooming the image as far as the resolution allowed. I'd know that walk anywhere. Cole's mind ran fast through the possibilities, and none of them were reassuring: sabotage, vandalism, or worse, something that might explain why a man skilled enough at supply theft to nearly cost their platoon its life a decade earlier would be creeping around a restaurant's back door after closing with his hands full of unidentified equipment. Call it in, Cole said, already moving toward the back hallway, keeping his voice low. Ranger pressed silent and coiled against his leg exactly the way he had been the night of the gas leak. I'll keep eyes on him till they get here. Sarge, you understand me, call it in now. Don't wait to see what he's up to. Reyes was already dialing, his voice tight and controlled as he gave the dispatcher the address and the situation, and Cole moved to the small window beside the back door, watching Osgood's shadow work at something near the building's exterior gas meter and electrical panel. The exact vulnerable point, Cole realized with a lurch of understanding, that would let a man disable both power and gas monitoring simultaneously, the kind of setup that made an accidental-looking fire or explosion considerably easier to arrange and considerably harder to trace back to deliberate sabotage. Ranger's low growl had built steadily the whole time, and when Osgood, apparently satisfied with whatever he'd rigged at the meter, moved toward the back door itself, testing the handle, finding it locked, and pulling something from his jacket that caught a glint of the streetlight in a way that made Cole's stomach drop, Ranger's restraint finally broke, not into panic, but into the same disciplined, purposeful advance Cole had come to recognize as trained rather than instinctive. Throwing himself against the door with a volume and ferocity that made Osgood stumble backward in the alley, with a curse loud enough to carry through the wood. Police are 2 minutes out, Reyes said, coming up fast behind Cole, and together they watched through the window as Osgood, spooked by the dog's sudden violent alert and the realization that his approach had been noticed, abandoned whatever he'd been attempting and bolted back down the alley toward a car idling at the far end, the same black sedan Cole had clocked parked across the street on more evenings than seemed coincidental. The responding officers arrived within minutes, followed shortly by a fire department hazmat technician once Reyes explained what he'd seen at the meter, and the technician's assessment, delivered with the grim seriousness of a man who understood exactly how close a call this had been, confirmed everything Cole's instincts had already told him. Osgood had tampered with the gas meter's shutoff valve and disconnected a safety sensor, a setup that, combined with a small incendiary device found discarded in the alley where he dropped it in his panic retreat, would have produced an explosion within the hour that arson investigators later confirmed would almost certainly have been ruled accidental, the gas leak explanation conveniently supported by the restaurant's own prior maintenance record, a record they'd later understand. That Roland Prout's manufactured violations had been quietly padding for exactly this purpose. Osgood was picked up within the hour, his getaway car intercepted less than 2 miles from the restaurant, and under the particular pressure that comes with an attempted arson charge stacked on top of a prior federal conviction, he talked considerably more freely than Panhandle Premier Properties would have liked, laying out in a signed statement the full scope of the arrangement, Preston Yates' instructions to eliminate the block's last holdout by any means that could plausibly look accidental. Prout's bribed inspections designed to build a paper trail of neglect that would make an eventual fire look like the tragic result of an owner who'd let his building fall into disrepair, and Osgood's own eager willingness to handle the dirty work himself, driven by a resentment toward Reyes and the old unit that had never fully faded even after years apart. The investigation that followed, run jointly by the fire marshal's office and eventually the district attorney once the scope of the bribery scheme became clear, moved with considerably more speed and seriousness than either Cole or Reyes had expected, aided enormously by the documentary trail Cole had already assembled and handed over in full. Preston Yates was indicted within 6 weeks on charges of conspiracy to commit arson and bribery of a public official. Roland Prout lost his job and faced his own charges for accepting the bribes, and Panhandle Premier Properties, facing a scandal that made every one of its other acquisitions in the block suddenly look considerably more suspicious, quietly abandoned the development project entirely rather than risk further scrutiny. There was a hearing months later, at which Cole testified about what he'd witnessed and what he'd uncovered, standing in a courtroom in a suit Reyes had bought him for the occasion, Ranger waiting patiently outside under the care of one of the restaurant's servers, because the courthouse didn't permit animals inside. He answered the questions plainly, the way he'd once given after-action reports, without embellishment, because the facts spoke for themselves clearly enough without any help from him. Reyes offered Cole a full partnership in the restaurant not long after the dust had settled, a gesture Cole had initially tried to refuse out of the same stubborn pride that had kept him out of assistance lines for months on the street, until Ray's had cut him off mid-protest with the same tone of unshakable authority he'd once used to order a medevac. "You didn't just wash my dishes, Bishop," Ray's said. "You and that dog saved this place and probably my life along with it. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you how it's gonna be." Cole took the partnership eventually, though what mattered more to him, in the quiet months that followed, wasn't the modest ownership stake or the steadier income it brought, but the particular shape his days had taken on, mornings spent prepping alongside a man who'd once carried him out of a burning compound, afternoons with Ranger dozing in his customary corner by the back hallway, evenings closing up a business that felt, more each week, less like a job and more like a second unit he belonged to. He got his own apartment eventually, small but clean, close enough to walk to the restaurant most mornings with Ranger limping contentedly alongside him, and found that the nightmares, while never fully gone, had eased into something he could live alongside rather than something that ran his whole life. There was an evening, nearly a year after that first turned-away entrance at the Forward Line's front door, when Cole found himself standing behind the host's stand himself, welcoming customers in for a Thursday dinner rush, Ranger dozing in his corner a few feet away, and caught sight of a man in a stained jacket lingering uncertainly on the sidewalk outside. Studying the menu in the window, with the particular hesitant posture of someone unsure whether a place like this was meant for someone like him. Cole didn't hesitate. He came around the podium the way Ray's once had for him, pushed the door open, and said, "Come on in, table's ready whenever you are, and bring your dog if you've got one out there. We've got a whole corner set up just for that." The man blinked at him, startled by the warmth of it, and Cole understood, watching him step inside, that some debts didn't get paid off all at once. Some of them you paid forward instead, one open door at a time, for as long as you had doors left to open. If Cole and Ray's and Ranger's story moved you today, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It truly helps this channel keep bringing you stories like theirs. Let us know in the comments what part of this one stuck with you most, or if you've ever had someone from your own past show up right when you needed them. And if you know somebody who could use a story like this today, go ahead and share it with them. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.